Imagine a game where, with a single button press, reality itself reassembled before your eyes. That's the cornerstone mechanic for one of the greatest sleeper hits to ever hit the PS1's library. 1999's cult classic, Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver. In an era where fully 3D worlds were still a novelty, Soul Reaver didn't just build one world, it crafted two, intricately woven together. The material and spectral realms were two sides of the same coin, each holding secrets invisible to the other. To progress, players had to think in multiple dimensions, solving puzzles that transcended a single reality.
Balancing that coin on its edge, if you will.
This mind-bending mechanic earned Soul Reaver critical acclaim, yet over time, the franchise has faded into obscurity, remembered only by a passionate few. And yet, I can't help but wonder, how exactly did Soul Reaver's world-swapping mechanic actually work? And, more intriguingly, how simple would it be to recreate today? Let's find out. Okay, so how could Soul Reaver possibly even work on the PS1? In the game, you're supposedly switching between the material realm and the spectral realm, different worlds, but what's actually happening under the hood? Well, as you might expect on hardware as primitive as the original PlayStation, things are a fair bit more mundane than switching entire realities. There are a few different tricks working in unison to bring Soul Reaver's most standout feature to life. Let's start with the most obvious, the color palette. Being released in 1999, 5 years into the PS1's life, Soul Reaver was already pushing the PlayStation to its absolute limits. Characters with skeletal animations, high-resolution textures, for the time, and a dynamic data streaming system that let you explore the world without ever being interrupted by a dedicated loading screen. It was always kind of loading in the background. This is pretty commonplace in games today, but at the time it was really novel. Because of this, the game couldn't just drop every polygon being displayed and load an entirely new map at the press of a button. Even putting aside the streaming, the raw speed of the disk drive on the original PlayStation was too slow to pull in all that new data fast enough. You'd be forced to enter a load screen. Obviously, that would be less than ideal for gameplay. Moving back and forth between worlds was a cornerstone of the game's puzzles. So instead, a single map is altered to become a spectral reflection of reality, and the effect starts with a ghostly, haunting change in color palette, with the entire area being bathed in a greenish teal hue that makes everything feel darker, painted in eldritch caustics. To achieve this effect, Soul Reaver used a tried and true technique present in almost every PlayStation game ever released. It's a second way of adding details to models, in addition to textures. With a texture, you take a 2D image and project it onto polygons that make up the model, mapping the image onto the 3D shape. This technique, by contrast, lets you set colors for the vertices, or points, that make up the model itself. If you've watched a previous video on Silent Hill, you've probably already guessed it. The technique is vertex painting. Because the PS1 has such low poly models, there are only a handful of vertices to paint on, so the raw detail you can represent versus a texture is a lot lower. However, you can combine vertex colors with textures to create more complex effects than either could achieve on their own. A common use case was painting unique shadow placement on repeating tiles of textures to break up their repetition. Soul Reaver's Material Realm map uses this technique as well. All these shaded areas on the map are vertex colors painted on top of the game's texture. When we switch to the Spectral Realm though, they take on a whole new level. No pun intended. A second layer of vertex painting covers the entire level, changing the colors from the gothic, stark palette to the eerie, saturated look of the Spectral Realm. This is a lot less data intensive than loading new geometry, so it can be done in real time, even subtly fading in to make the transition nice and smooth. What's interesting is that this doesn't replace the vertex colors, it adds another layer on top. So, how to recreate this effect with modern tools? Well, getting vertex color set up is pretty straightforward. It's still an effect used in modern 3D pipelines, so it's easy to create a simple test asset in Blender, give it a basic texture, then add a vertex layer, and paint on whatever we want. We can add as many layers as we want in Blender, just like something like Photoshop. So having a layer for the shadows and a layer for the spectral colors is no problem. The problems start, though, when trying to bring this technique into Unity. Says here that Unity only supports one layer of vertex colors. Uh-oh.
So, we gotta figure out a way around this. Soul Reaver was most likely made in a proprietary custom game engine. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was the same engine they made the original 3D Gex games in, oddly enough. Shout out to an icon. They could easily add more functionality when they needed it since it was their own engine. Unfortunately, I'm just a dummy with no programming knowledge using Unity, so I just kind of work with the cards I've been dealt here. But like, come on. There's got to be a way around this, right?
Of course there is. So, a color value in computer graphics is technically 4 numbers. A red value, a green value, a blue value, and an alpha or transparency value. By mixing different intensities of red, green, and blue, we can create a whole bunch of different colors, and with an alpha channel, we can control how transparent that color is. What's convenient about the effect we're trying to achieve here is that the spectral realm colors are all the same level of transparency, so they're really only using the RGB channels. And the shadows are all black, so each R, G, and B channel are basically the same, so we only need one of them. Because of that, we can combine the RGB values of the spectral realm layer, then take one of the shadow layer's values, I'll choose red, and combine them into a new, single RGBA vertex paint layer that contains the information for both the shadows and the colors in a single group. Man, math is so useful. I wish school had made it more interesting as a kid so I'd actually understand it. Maybe someday. In Unity, simply importing this model and dropping it into the scene won't do anything. We have to set up the material ourselves manually so the engine knows how to handle the vertex paint layer we just made. Then, we need to do some scripting so it can animate. I won't bore you with all the details, but we basically throw together a bunch of nodes in shader graph that take the vertex paint layer we combined and split it back into 2 separate segments, the RGB spectral and the black and white shadows. Once they're split, we can use some more nodes to blend them together, controlled by 2 different variables, so we can access those values in our script and have them change over time with the press of a button. A simple Playmaker script later, we now have a normal, textured, and shaded environment that we can fade the spectral colors into on command. Color changing is only half the battle though. When you swap realms in Soul Reaver, the entire level twists and deforms when you go into the spectral realm, only to spring back to normal position when you shift back. Again, since the PlayStation couldn't load new level geometry on the fly, simply manipulating the level that was already in memory to give the layouts more visual differences was primarily an economic choice. But it ended up being more than that too. While Soul Reaver is about vampires, betrayal, and a quest for revenge, the majority of the game is focused more around platforming and puzzle solving than combat. The game used its world swapping mechanic directly in its puzzles. The shift in level design wasn't just for aesthetics. Certain elements of the level moving around would allow for traversal paths to open up in one world that wasn't available in the other. To get through the game, you had to intelligently switch between both versions of the world and leverage these changes to get to new areas. The toggle wasn't just a simple switch though. To make the puzzles more challenging, Raziel could retreat back to the spectral realm from any time and any location, but manifesting in the physical world required a portal, so you could only go back to reality from fixed locations. This added another dimension to the puzzle solving, making otherwise trivial obstacles more complex. Observing the game and researching this video though, I'd wager that this was also a necessary mechanic to help mitigate some technical headaches the designers faced while making this game. Probably the biggest potential issue for creating a game with dynamic shifting level design is the increased potential for clipping. Clipping is when a character or object passes through another solid object it wasn't intended to. All 3D objects in video games contain both the geometry that make up the visual graphics that we see, but also a second, invisible object that controls its physical shape in the math of the game engine. So, what do you do if you have a game where the level can move between 2 different states? Well, you're gonna need 2 different collision shapes, one for each layout of the world. But if the player can transition those 2 states at any time, what would prevent them from triggering the change on a platform that shrinks away, causing them to fall? Or what about the opposite, a wall that expands and traps them outside the level? By strictly controlling at least one side of these transitions to specific areas, the designers of Soul Reaver could construct levels that changed, but in ways that allowed these moving elements to only be accessed from one direction, for lack of a better term. If a platform on one side of the room changes, make it out of reach in the material realm, where the player has total freedom, and accessible in the spectral realm. In order to get out of the spectral realm, the player will have to go to the portal located on the other side of the room, away from the platform, so the change in collision shape happens away from them, keeping the integrity of the world intact. This kind of level design took a lot of careful planning to make work, my dudes. My brain just hurts thinking about it. So, that was a lot of big brain theory, but now we know why these levels are changing. Next, we gotta tackle the how. Luckily, that's a lot simpler to explain. In 3D, there are a few different ways to animate stuff. Basic keyframes, where you set positions, rotations, and scales of objects that change over time. Skeletal animation, where an underlying control rig that represents joints drive the deformation of a 3D object bound to it. This is mostly used for characters. And blend shapes, where the actual positions of the points that make up the 3D model itself can be set to a bunch of different positions, then interpolate, or blend, between each other. This is commonly used for complex animation that requires a lot of finesse that would be trickier to control with skeletal animation. Think stuff like facial expressions, where subtle changes to the face can completely transform the expression. Soul Reaver doesn't have facial animations like that, its characters are too simple to need that level of control, but blend shapes are being used instead to guide the shifting and the level layouts between the material and spectral realms. The environments all have two different layouts as distinct blend shapes. By animating the influence of one versus the other, it can transition between the two. Much like the vertex colors, this is still a very common technique in modern 3D, so replicating it in a modern game engine is also pretty straightforward. Blender has a dedicated menu for creating blend shapes, although despite the application being called Blender, they renamed blend shapes to shape keys for some reason. By creating a basis shape key, then adding a second spectral realm alternative, and adjusting the position of the geometry while inside it, we can now easily blend back and forth between these two versions of the object. In Unity, we just have to add to our script to adjust this value over time. By creating a new animation attached to the object and setting the blend shape value to change, we can then reference that animation in our script and have it play back and forth at the press of a button. Combine that with the color transition and we have the effect working in engine. So, there we go, our proof of concept. This can be done, but I mean, this is just a square. Where's the fun in stopping here? Let's take this to the next level and create an actual, playable little scene where we can really put the system to the test and really bring that classic Soul Reaver vibe. Let's get started. Like any project, we should probably start with a character. Azumi is mostly purple, so she'll look nice contrasting against the dark greens and blues of the spectral realm. When you're an artist, this is how you make character design decisions. We already have some animations for her from the Resident Evil video, but we'll need to add a jump animation to make her work here. Looking pretty good. We'll use Cinemachine to quickly set up a standard orbiting third-person camera. Instead of having it be controlled with the shoulder buttons though, we'll modernize it to use the second analog stick, or the mouse if you're playing with a keyboard. With all that done, we have a simple, third-person Azumi that can move, jump, and swap between worlds, which is everything she'll need to do for this demo scene. Next up, the environment. Soul Reaver had an impeccable sense of atmosphere. The dark, gothic, oppressive world felt bleak and drained of life, which contrasted with the much brighter but still unnerving spectral realm. Much of the beginning of the game takes place in large, spacious canyons, with towering rock faces and abandoned architecture that fade into a thick green haze. This is the vibe I'm going for in my test scene. Almost every environment on the original PlayStation used a texture atlas. By creating a series of tiles that can seamlessly repeat over and over, you can cover large amounts of space in a level while only using a tiny amount of memory for the texture. By creating our environment out of a bunch of squares, we can map each square to a single tile from the simple tile map, covering the entire space with an image that's only 128 by 128 pixels, the typical size for a PS1 texture. In a full game, you'd have a lot more tiles to create more intricate designs, but I don't have the massive budget and a team of artists working for me, so we'll have to make do with something a bit more humble. Lastly, let's add some pillars in the middle of the map. Nosgoth was falling apart after centuries of suffering under Kane's influence, so we can represent that abandoned architecture here, at least in a small way. They'll also double as some simple platforms for jumping later. Since these tiles are all we have for textures, the environment is going to feel pretty sparse and repetitive. To help break up the monotony and give the map a better sense of dimension, we can add in some vertex painted shadows on top of the textures, and give the ground a bit of extra tonality. That takes care of the shadow layer, but we still gotta add the spectral realm layer. Luckily, that's a lot easier to do. We just gotta create another layer, fill it with teal, select a random amount of vertices, which Blender conveniently has a button for, and change those to green. And just like that, the spectral layer is done. Back in Unity, now that the level is significantly larger, let's make sure to add some distance fog to the game as well. This was a technical limitation of the PS1's draw distance, but it added a ton to the hazy, decaying feel of Nosgoth. Luckily, it's just a single node and shader graph added to our level shader to get some fog of our own going. Then, we just script the fog's color to blend between two values when we world swap, just like it did in Soul Reaver proper. Most importantly though, we need to add a new object to the project, a portal. Remember, in Soul Reaver, you can only get back to the material realm at certain locations. Right now, we can change at will, which will break the puzzle solving and introduce issues with the colliders. We'll also add an invisible box trigger to the portal, which will let us enable some game logic in combination with the player. To make these work in-game, we'll add a check in the world swap logic to see if changing worlds is valid. While Izumi is standing on a portal, and inside that invisible trigger, we'll enable this toggle to be true, so a world swap can happen. As soon as she steps out of them, it'll toggle off to false, and she can't swap back, effectively trapping her in the spectral realm unless you're at a portal. In the material realm, we'll just add one massive collider that envelops the entire map, so no matter where you are, world swapping in this version of the level is always valid. One last tiny detail to add is a bit to our script so that, while the world is changing, we disable the player's movement so they can't accidentally clip through anything while the collision shapes are changing. We should also make it so that you can only swap worlds while on the ground, so you don't swap while jumping. Soul Reaver did the exact same thing for Raziel. With all these things complete, we end up with a little something like this. It's honestly kind of crazy how well this demo project came out, and how close to the look of Soul Reaver we got with it. This game has always been one of my absolute favorites on the PS1, especially from an aesthetic standpoint. This is one of the games on the system, along with Final Fantasy IX, that really inspired me to love this aesthetic in the first place. So being able to create something that looks and feels so close to a game that felt like magic when I was growing up is just... it's really crazy, honestly. Putting this together also gave me a massive appreciation for the level design in Soul Reaver. Trying to control for all the possibilities just in my little demo level made me realize the staggering amount of little considerations that had to be made for the puzzles to not break from the player doing something unintentional in the full Soul Reaver game. Keeping these things in mind for an experience measured in hours, not minutes, must have been a nightmare to bug test. There have been rumors of a remastered version of Soul Reaver ever since some logos leaked at Comic-Con in the beginning of 2024. This series has been dormant ever since Legacy of Kain Defiance came out all the way back in 2004, so I'd absolutely love to see these games and their incredible characters get some love again. While just a straight port of these games would be appreciated, if a bit underwhelming, and the series seems a bit too long forgotten to get an entire remake in the vein of like the Demon's Souls remake, I'd really love to see at least Soul Reaver 1 get something like the Tomb Raider remastered treatment that came out a while back. It would be awesome to experience Nosgoth in a whole new way, and to see how these effects would be approached with contemporary tools. Hopefully, we don't have to wait much longer. Can we just take a moment to talk about how absolutely incredible the script of this game is? I know this has nothing to do with the graphics, but this was a PlayStation 1 game. Games back then did not have writing or voice acting on this level at the time. Your average PS1 game had dialogue and delivery like this.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
Meanwhile, Soul Reaver's out here dropping bangers like this.
This world is wrecked with cataclysms. The earth strains to shrug off the pestilence of Cain's parasitic empire. The fate of this world was preordained in an instant by a solitary man.
Absolutely mind-boggling. The writing, directing, and vocal performances in this game could stand shoulder to shoulder with the best examples this year. Truly ahead of its time. The only thing that's really letting Soul Reaver down at this point is the limited character animations. Such emotive acting feels betrayed by basic cutscenes and static characters. All the more reason that I hope this remaster is actually happening and is given more effort than a simple port. This game was decades ahead of its time, aspiring beyond what the hardware of the day could do. The scope of the game had to be drastically cut back, and the story was hamstrung by hardware ill-suited for the emotional depths that it was grasping at. I really can't think of another game that deserves a remake or remaster more, aside from maybe the original Blood Omen. If you're curious, I've uploaded the demo project I made for this video at the itch.io link in the description, if you want to give it a try yourself. Heads up though, there is a random bug where sometimes when you jump, Azumi just goes flying off into space. This has happened a few times when I've used Unity's character controller, and I've never been able to figure out why. If you know, definitely clue me in down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about vertex painting and lighting effects, check out this next video on Silent Hill's Flashlight, where we break down and go into even more detail about the PS1 hardware and the weird quirks to get things working on it. If you've got other things to do, understandable, but I'd super appreciate a like on this video and a sub to the channel to show YouTube there's an audience for weird retro analysis like this. If you really want to help me out, you can watch the extended cuts of every Pop Strikers video over on my Patreon. They have a ton of content not in the YouTube releases, along with over 130 bonus podcasts where I answer your questions every week. Also, before you go, let me know if there's a certain game, effect, or mechanic in a PS1 or N64 game you'd want to learn about. Hell, if I'm feeling generous, I may even consider a Sega Saturn title. Hit me up here, on Twitter, or Blue Sky. Links are in the description. Until next time, I'm just Oliver, this is Pop Strikers, and you've been awesome. Thank you so much for watching.